Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's guest is Dr. Bonner Cohen, and our topic is the unfolding food crisis. Now, several hundred Israeli companies are developing food technology solutions in view of the unfolding food crisis. That is good because farmers, especially small farmers, are under siege. Consumers worldwide are feeling the pain too, given the unavailability of food staples and skyrocketing prices of essential food. Weekly visits to the supermarket have turned into traumatic events. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast series. I'm David Wanatik. Thank you for joining us today. Today's focus is going to be a discussion on the unfolding food crisis. Speaking on this issue, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Bonner Cohen, who is a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, where he concentrates on energy, natural resources, and international relations. He also serves as a senior policy advisor with the Heartland Institute, senior policy analyst with the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and as an adjunct scholar at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So, Dr. Cohen, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So last night I went to the grocery store and it was a bit late at night, but lots of the shelves were scarcely populated with products. You know, they're pretty barren, and that's been my experience over the last year and a half. To what extent is that a function of the stores just not having enough people to stock their shelves versus more endemic problems with the food supply chain?
I think it's somewhat the former, but actually, in large measure, the latter. What you experienced last night, untold millions of Americans and Europeans and what have you, have been experiencing also for the past year and a half. There are indeed problems with the supply chain, and those problems are such that they have been caused by a range of factors, including, to a certain extent, the pandemic. But I think there are other forces at work here. And this will go directly to the subject we'll be dealing with, the unfolding food crisis. One of the reasons why the shelves are either empty or what you find on the shelves is more expensive than it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, is that the cost of getting food from where it is grown to the market. That can be a supermarket or it can be a village in Africa or wherever we are talking about. There are obstacles in the way. First and foremost, I would say, has been the dramatic rise, and this is particularly the case in the United States, in the price of diesel fuel. And that cuts in two ways. First and foremost, when food goes from the farm to the supermarket, it has to be transported. And the primary means of transport is the truck, and the fuel that is put into the truck is diesel. If you have a shortage in diesel fuel, which we are experiencing in the U.S. now, you're going to have higher prices for diesel, which means that those prices will be reflected in what you buy at the store. But there's something else going on here that also pertains to diesel. Diesel fuel is used in farm equipment, such as tractors. And if the price of diesel is more expensive for the farmer to put in his tractor, that too is going to be reflected in the cost of food. So what we have here is it has simply become more expensive to get produce and what have you, meat and whatever, from the farm or the ranch or the fruit grove or whatever it is to the supermarket. Now, we ask ourselves, well, how can that be? Isn't the United States abundantly blessed with natural resources? Don't we have an enormous amount of oil and natural gas that would enable us to move things from point A to point B at a relatively reasonable price? The answer is, of course, yes. But sadly, we also have policies in place, and by the way, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere, that have made fossil fuels more expensive, less abundant, and as these fossil fuels used for our purposes this afternoon to transport items from point A to point B. As those prices go, as the price of fossil fuels goes up, the price of food will also go up, and we find ourselves actually in the absurd situation that we have diesel fuel, which is in abundance in the United States, or should be, and we're dealing with a shortage. So this is certainly something that I think all Americans are experiencing when they go to the supermarket. And I would add that for similar reasons, but not entirely identical reasons, people, say, in Europe, South America, and elsewhere are seeing exactly the same thing.
So to what extent is the rise in diesel fuel prices a function of lack of exploration versus refining capacity or burdensome regulations?
It's all three, except the lack of exploration. Frankly, the oil and gas companies would love to explore and they would love to extract. But for that, they need permits, particularly from the federal government, particularly on federal land. And the Biden administration, since coming to power, has made it exceedingly difficult to get these permits. We also have a permitting system in this country, and we've had this for, frankly, a long time, that makes it very difficult to do just about anything. A large public works project, to put in a rail system or to build something, you have to get X number of permits, and it takes a long time. But if you have an administration in power, such as we have now, that is openly hostile to fossil fuels, then they're going to make it extremely difficult to get permits to go in and extract oil and natural gas. In the case of natural gas, they also have gone to extraordinary lengths, and they've done this with oil too, actually, to block the construction of pipelines that ship either oil or natural gas across the country. Well, if you suppress the production of oil and natural gas owing to your climate-related hostility to oil and natural gas, and if you systematically undermine the infrastructure needed to transport the oil and natural gas, you are going to also make it more, provide no incentives whatsoever to the oil and natural gas industry to invest the enormous sums of money necessary to go in and exploit a field and to produce the oil and gas that we demonstrably need. That also goes to the issue of refineries. The United States hasn't built a new refinery since 1978. No one should be surprised that our failure to build a new petroleum refineries, disproportionately located along the Gulf Coast of the U.S., And never mind the fact that our population has grown, our needs for transportation fuel has grown. But why should oil and gas companies, the whole petroleum industry, invest heavily in refineries, knowing full well that getting the permits to do so will take a month of Sundays, and that they will be facing an abundant amount of lawsuits,
Okay.
And what have you, by the environmental industry, so by the environmental group. So it's going to be, so there are all sorts of barriers in place to keep that from happening.
Okay. So that's the rising price of diesel fuel is one reason that there's a shortage of food on the shelves. Another thing that we mentioned is the pandemic. I can understand that in the beginning days of the pandemic, everybody was frightened and, reasonably so. We didn't know anything. And if I was working at a food processing plant and I was, elbows length to people on both sides of me,
Right.
and, I would maybe not want to work there. But, I think the pandemic is pretty much over. So is there a reason why people should not go to work in the food processing industry?
Oh, none whatever. As you said, the pandemic is all but over, and people, looking for jobs should definitely go into the food processing industry. We are gradually building up herd immunity to whatever strain of COVID-19 is coming along. We're in much better shape than we were a year and a half, 2 years ago. So that should not be a factor in this.
Okay. Is there an increasing effort to unionize at food assembly plants?
Yes, there is, with mixed results. You can also, you see the same thing going on there that you do at Amazon outlets around the country, the fulfillment centers. I would not, at this point, say that's been a huge factor. It could be if the efforts to unionize at food processing plants become successful. One of the predictable consequences of that will be the wages will go up. As those wages go up, food prices will go up accordingly. Right now, I wouldn't say that's a major factor.
Okay. So the scarcity of products on the shelf really should not be much of a function of the pandemic causing a slowdown in work at food assembly operations.
No, certainly not. Again, in the first few months, yes, but not now.
Okay. So another thing that the Biden administration has blamed on lack of food and higher prices of food is the Russians' invasion of Ukraine. And, definitely everyone would agree it's a terrible thing for one country to invade another for no reason. And, there's a lot of misery and death, and that's a horrible thing. As far as the production of food, though, I believe the Ukraine accounted for 11 or 13% of the world's caloric consumption. But how much grain and wheat is actually coming out of Ukraine now and Russia now?
Now that there is an agreement in place to allow grain to go from Ukraine across the Black Sea through the Bosporus and into the Mediterranean, being overseen primarily by Turkey, this is not as big a thing as it was a few months ago. Now, I would point out that that agreement is a very tenuous thing. It is subject to the ups and downs of the military conflict going on there. There were very legitimate concerns that a lack of grain transport from Ukraine to places such as North Africa and the Middle East would have very dire consequences. That's why measures were taken, and the Russians and the Ukrainians, and being mediated by the Turks and to a lesser extent the UN, were able to reach an agreement. I would simply point out it's on shaky ground, and it is subject to whatever goes on in the military conflict.
Do we know what percent of foodstuffs are coming out of the Ukraine now compared to before the war?
We have not yet reached the levels of the pre-February 24th, 2022 levels. They have ticked up. I don't know the percentage offhand. And you have to be very careful, particularly during wartime, to believe any figures that you get. But there has been a marginal improvement, certainly from where we were several months ago. But again, stay tuned, because the situation there is still very, very uncertain.
Right. They say in war, the first casualty is the truth.
Always.
So Russia itself is also a big producer of harvests and grains and wheats and so forth. Are there boycotts on Russian crops, or are they shipping out as much as they?
The Russian crops. Russia, most people don't know this. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. And as much as we see sanctions being put on other Russian products, particularly its oil, with China and India and Iran making up for some of that, but not yet on wheat. There is a recognition on the part of people who purchase wheat from Russia that they need to feed their population. So we haven't seen that yet.
Okay. So we really can't blame the pandemic for the food shortages. Really can't blame the situation in the Ukraine that much. Maybe somewhat, but not to a huge extent. It seems that there are people that have a political ideology to take policies that they know will restrict the production of food, harvests and livestock and so on. So and maybe we can talk about that. These progressive people, they have all these policies, this and climate change, theory that they subscribe to. They don't want any more fertilizer, and they don't want any more natural gas produced, and natural gas is needed for fertilizer, and fertilizer is needed for growing crops, and crops are needed to feed animals and people and so forth. So anyway, maybe you can tell us your overview of that, then I can ask specific questions.
Now we're coming to the core of the whole matter, and it's one that's actually very serious. The entire agenda aimed at addressing what we are told, and I would say in the absence of any real evidence, is a climate crisis. We are determined, we being governments around the world, NGOs, as well as certain corporate interests who think they can make some money on alternative sources of energy. All of these people are pushing for a climate agenda, which, among other things, would lower or at the very least freeze the atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, using the argument that rising levels of atmospheric CO2 is leading to a potentially disastrous warming of the climate. Now, there are all sorts of problems with that. Problem number one is, aside from the fact that there's no evidence of that, the Earth is about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer now than it was 250 or 300 years ago. But that's simply the Earth rebounding from the Little Ice Age, which existed roughly between 1350 and 1800, 1850. It's a perfectly normal thing that we go through. Climate is unstable. The universe is unstable. What you see today isn't necessarily what you're going to see tomorrow. The consequence of demonizing actually atmospheric CO2 is that CO2, as we learned or should have learned in a high school science class, is plant food. And I would argue that if you really want to see a food crisis of epic proportions, you should greatly limit and reduce the atmospheric levels of CO2. Currently, they're around 420 parts per million, up from about 250, 275 at the end of the Little Ice Age. That rise in atmospheric CO2 levels has actually been highly beneficial. It has been beneficial because it has helped boost agricultural productivity. It has led to a very noticeable greening of the earth. Just look at satellite photos of the earth taken from thousands of miles up in the sky, and you will see that the earth is a much greener place today than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago, simply because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 has another interesting quality to it. In addition to fostering the growth of plants, and that includes crops, the higher the level of CO2, the less water plants, and that also includes crops, require. So if you lower the level of atmospheric CO2, saying that this is the way to combat quote unquote climate change, what you're actually also doing is lowering agricultural productivity, and you're putting increased demand on water. Water is not an infinite resource. And if we have policies in place that simultaneously reduce agricultural productivity while increasing global demand for water, you are creating a situation that will, in fact, be a crisis, one far more serious than the so-called climate crisis that some would have us believe we're going through now.
That's interesting. I didn't know that a rise in CO2 makes crops less dependent on water.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yes.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. Okay. So maybe you can just expand on the situation with fertilizer. So there's a war against fertilizer. Fertilizer's verboten now. And the theory is that there's nitrogen in there, and nitrogen is supposed to be bad, and natural gas, and we know natural gas is bad too. So we're not supposed to use any more fertilizer or very limited amounts. Can you talk about that? And
yes,
are there
absolutely.
are there alternatives to fertilizer?
Yeah. Fertilizer that we use today, which is absolutely essential to agriculture, uses as one of its constituent parts natural gas. A war on fossil fuels, which means also a war on natural gas. And if you reduce the production and distribution of natural gas, and if you raise the price of natural gas, you're going to put huge strains on fertilizer. Farmers need fertilizer to grow crops. In the absence of fertilizer, or fertilizer that they find it increasingly difficult to purchase because it's becoming more expensive, what is there currently available that can take the place of fertilizer? The answer is really nothing. We recently saw in Sri Lanka a crisis that unfolded last summer when the government undertook an effort to lower the nitrogen content of fertilizer there. What happened? Well, among other things, the government was overthrown. It was overthrown because the farmers could no longer grow the crops that allowed for their subsistence. And these are just the kinds of things that we're going to see happen not just in Sri Lanka, but elsewhere, if we make it more difficult and more expensive for the people who grow our crops to have fertilizer. This week, we passed the 8 billion mark, the number of people who live on the earth. Well, we're going to have to feed these people somehow. And to do so, we need to boost agricultural productivity. For that, you not only need higher levels of atmospheric CO2, you're also going to need fertilizer. And it's important to recognize that most of the really good cropland in the world, whether it's in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, is already under cultivation. So the lands that are not under cultivation are at best marginal. which means we're going to have to develop technologies that will boost productivity on the farmlands that we have that we know are, for the most part, good. And we're also going to have to come up with technologies, and this is where a lot of brainy people sitting in agricultural departments or in companies around the world need to put their thinking caps on and say, how can we boost productivity on marginal farmland? Because as long as the Earth's population continues to rise, and that rise is slowing down and will probably go into reverse in a couple of decades, but as long as we have 8 billion people on the Earth, those people need to be fed. And there is one other angle to this, and your question about exporting Russian and Ukrainian grain goes directly to this. How is grain transported around the world? It's transported by ship. And how do we propel ships? We do so with a petroleum-based fuel called bunker fuel. It's a cousin of diesel. If you have a war against petroleum-based fuels, which we are, which is being carried out even as we speak at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, if you have that, and if you start making bunker fuel more expensive, which is exactly what we're doing, you are also going to make it more expensive to ship grains around the world, particularly to poorer countries that desperately need it. So here you have an absolutely absurd situation, whereas in the name of combating climate change, we're also creating two parallel crises. One, we can see clearly before our eyes, the energy shortages that are most acute in Europe, but also are showing a very ugly face here in the United States and elsewhere. And we are contributing to an unfolding food crisis because we're also, in addition to suppressing agricultural productivity, we're making it more expensive and more difficult to transport grains once they have been harvested.
Right. Okay. I read that the problem with fertilizer is so acute. I mean, it's causing food prices to rise as well, but it's getting to be so expensive that farmers can't afford it, and that in places like Oregon, they're actually considering at least using decomposing bodies as fertilizer, similar to what they do in North Korea.
And once we've reached the level of North Korea, we should have no illusions about what world we're living in. The mere fact that that's being talked about shows you how far we have fallen, because there's absolutely no excuse for that whatsoever. But as long as government policies at the federal, state, in some cases local level are in place that do not allow for the production of fertilizers, we shouldn't be surprised that in desperate situations, desperate people will do desperate things.
Right. So there's a movement among a lot of banks and major investment firms to not provide capital to farmers and ranchers. And the SEC has a proposal that any farmer that deals with a publicly traded company would have to track their carbon emissions, and a bunch of other regulations would fall on them if they do interact with public companies, which they have to at some point.
That's exactly right. The SEC doesn't have any jurisdiction over Farmer Brown in Iowa or wherever he is, but it does have jurisdiction over the companies, the publicly traded companies that farmers around the country have to deal with. And the reporting requirements that the Biden administration's SEC wants to impose nationwide through a regulation would require disclosures, climate-related disclosures by companies. Going one step further, what about the entities that supply those companies with products, and that would also include farmers? Taken to its logical extent, that is going to mean that farmers themselves are ultimately going to be pulled into the SEC's new rule. even though SEC has actually no direct jurisdiction over them whatsoever, but it does have jurisdiction over other companies with which farmers of necessity do business. Now, I am certain that SEC rule is going to be challenged, and it will probably be overturned in court because nowhere is it written that the SEC has that kind of authority. And as a result of a Supreme Court decision earlier this year, West Virginia v. EPA, Supreme Court made it abundantly clear that on matters of major economic importance, regulatory agencies, and that can be EPA, that could be the SEC or whatever, cannot simply make up rules and regulations out of whole cloth. There has to be direct and unambiguous congressional authorization for them to do so. If not, they can't. So I fully expect this rule to be ultimately thrown out. But it does show the extent to which the ruling elite in this country is determined, again, in the name of combating climate change, to expand its regulatory writ over just about every human being and every business, every enterprise in the country.
Yeah, and there's been a big movement afoot by major banks and money management firms to not extend credit to the farmers, sort of a social credit type system like they have in China, I guess, and the American farmers don't score well on that. Those banks are being sued, I believe, by a number of attorney generals of various states.
Yeah, that's right. Because they have recognized rightly that the SEC does not have the authority to do this. The object of the game, from the standpoint of ESG, environment, social, and government investors, which are really investing with a political agenda, is to cut off the flow of capital, first and foremost, to the oil and gas industry. And once you do that, you essentially eliminate that industry, which the Biden administration is absolutely determined to do, and has actually been rather open about that. And when you do that, of course, you are strangling all sorts of enterprises around the country that desperately depend on oil and gas, because you aren't going to substitute oil and gas by using wind and solar and whatever else comes along. So you're absolutely right. Lawsuits have been filed by attorneys general in numerous states, and I personally think it will be ultimately successful.
Okay. Then if there weren't enough attacks on the American farmer, the Biden administration wants to broaden the definition of waters in the U.S. So, say more of the water belongs to the government, not the farmers. And then under the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, they're paying farmers not to farm.
Oh, yes, right. Waters of the United States is a fascinating subject, and we're going to hear a lot more about that soon because there's a case pending before the Supreme Court. The Clean Water Act has provisions that allows the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to regulate discharges into navigable waters of the United States. But the rest of the statute pertaining to all of this is actually rather vague. And over the years, and this is actually over decades, what was originally a water quality statute has become a land use control mechanism. What originally the Biden EPA, then overturned by the Trump EPA, and now reinvigorated by the Biden EPA, is trying to do is rewrite that rule. And what it ultimately would do is set up a scheme for federal zoning of private land that would, among other things, include drainage ditches, irrigation ditches, stock ponds, and all of these other bodies of water that don't necessarily have a direct connection to any navigable water anywhere around. But because it is a body of water, or for that matter, it could be a wetland, the EPA will say under this rule that it has jurisdiction over this. Again, that's not written anywhere, but in the administrative regulatory state, where people can make things up, or at least try to, this is certainly being attempted by the Biden administration. There's a case, as I said, pending before the Supreme Court, and you can rest assured that other lawsuits will be flying once the Biden administration finalizes its final Lotus of Waters of the U.S. rule.
Okay. And then anything you want to say about the Inflation Reduction Act paying farmers not to farm?
Yes, well, precisely at a time when we are seeing the prices of food rise around the country and the shortages on the shelves that you noticed last night, the terribly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act has decided or has determined that we would pay farmers not to grow certain crops. Well, the predictable consequence of that is that said crops will not be grown, and the lower the amount of crops that are produced, the higher the prices will be, which means that it will run directly counter to what the Inflation Reduction Act says it's all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a lot of the problems with the food supply are a function of government and liberal policy. To what extent is this a really mendacious, organized effort to reduce the food supply, make food very expensive, and I guess therefore more dependent on the government? If you're a poor person and you can't afford your food and you have to get government assistance, then you'll be tightly wedded to the government.
Oh yeah, I think the government and the today's left has an agenda that wants to make as many people as humanly possible dependent on the government in one form or another for their livelihood. And that takes all sorts of forms. One of the ways you can do that is you can create artificial shortages. We're seeing that in the industry, in the energy industry already. But these people think big. What they have been able successfully to do by creating energy shortages where there should be none is now to create food shortages. In many respects, this is, of course, well, it's obviously hubris on their part. It's also gigantic. There's a gigantic element of ignorance on their part. How many people who write rules and regulations for farmers have actually even set foot on a farm, much less lived on one and have a livelihood on one? In other words, our urban elite is completely out of touch with realities in rural America. They absolutely don't understand that world at all. They are very adept at wielding power, but in many respects, they have absolutely no idea what they're doing other than creating a structure that will make more people dependent on the government. The consequences, A, they don't really understand what they are, and B, they don't really care either.
Do you think it's just a naivete on their part, or do you think there's some calculation behind this?
I think it's both. I think naivete, ignorance of the subject matter, but they're so driven ideologically that they put their ignorance aside. They won't even acknowledge it. You won't see a lot of intellectual introspection among these people, but they are so convinced that what they are doing is ultimately the right thing to do because it will put more power and in some cases more money in their hands, that they are absolutely determined to move full scale ahead with this. So it's both.
To what extent is some of this being orchestrated by China? At the World Health Organization, we've seen how the Chinese basically control that. And there's a Chinese guy on one of the UN committees that's in charge of food production or whatever. And the Chinese have been buying up a lot of American food producers. They acquired Smithfield Foods a few years ago,
right,
and others, and all around the world, they're buying farmland and food production. So, to what extent are the Chinese behind these anti-farmer policies?
They're very much behind them because they recognize that once you get control, or some control, over a country's food supply, you are actually also controlling that country in no small way. And remember, coinciding with the food thing is the energy thing. The Biden administration's determination to abandon fossil fuels for renewable energy, such as wind turbines and solar panels, the ingredients, the raw materials that go into wind turbines and solar panels, as well as the batteries that will go into electric vehicles, are largely under the control of the People's Republic of China. And so what we are doing is we are putting ourselves geostrategically in the absurd situation where we are foregoing our own energy, and for that matter, food dependence, and making ourselves dependent on China, which is far and away our greatest global economic and geopolitical rival. The Chinese have figured all of this out. They are acting accordingly, and they're perfectly willing to use whatever influence they have, buy off as many people as they possibly can, buy up as much farmland in the U.S. and elsewhere as they possibly can, get control of as many lithium and cobalt and what have you mines as they can, so that the world will have to go to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they could do it with food too. They control more of the crops and food production facilities. It could get to the situation where food is being rationed, and at least in China, with facial recognition, they can determine who's supporting the government and who's not. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, and they literally you're literally dependent on the CCP to hand you food in China now with all the lockdowns, and you can't just go to the market. Anyway, have you followed the baby formula shortage that we had maybe a year ago?
Yes, that's right.
So why was there a baby food shortage?
There was a baby food. The origin of it was we don't have a lot of baby formula production facilities in the U.S. And we had indications early on that at one of the key facilities in the Midwest, there was a problem of possible contamination. And we certainly don't want baby food to become contaminated. So what was done is it was decided that to shut that plant, that facility down for a few weeks and look and see what the problem was. The problem was that the facility they shut down was responsible for well over 1/3 of all the baby formula created in the U.S. Now, if you shut down 1/3 of your supply, and you don't have anything in place to make up the difference, you're going to have a shortage. The Biden administration was absolutely asleep at the wheel on this. They had been warned about it. They ignored the warnings. When the situation got so bad that it finally surfaced and provided a lot of very ugly headlines. You're talking about empty shelves. I'm sure everyone saw the footage of shelves in supermarkets where baby formula should have been out. There was no baby formula there because the baby formula had never been created. So here you had a government with oversight over the production of baby formula, asleep at the wheel, ignoring warnings, having no plan B in place to make up the difference between what had been produced, the level that had been produced, which was of necessity going to be reduced once this facility was shut down. And we are only now getting back to more or less where we were before the baby shortage took place. But this is a really a superb and very sad example of government not paying any attention to the business that it is supposed to be doing, having no alternatives in place, not realizing that if you do A, that is going to have consequences for B, C, and D. They did not take that into consideration, and we were stuck with a completely artificial baby formula shortage. By the way, in retrospect, we now realize that there actually was no contamination in this Midwestern facility. There was a very minor problem. It was rather easily dealt with. But by the time the government got into this and looked it over, months and months and months had gone by, and the facility during which the facility produced absolutely nothing.
So my understanding is the problem is even, the roots of the problem can be looked at an earlier stage. My understanding is that the government required a very large percent of the baby formula to be sold to the various government programs, welfare or whatever,
yes. Yep.
All those kind of programs to subsidize the cost for the less wealthy people.
Right.
And because, I don't know if it was 50, 60, 70% of the production was going to those programs, only manufacturers that could produce in large volumes could get their unit costs down to a level where they could possibly make some money. Then there was no incentive for a new company to get into the business if your addressable market is crowded out by all these government programs and your competitors are already very large. So that's my understanding of what the genesis.
Yes, you're right about that. Yes, yeah. That made a bad situation worse because all of this, the baby formula that was produced was earmarked for these various food subsistence programs that the federal government operates.
Yeah. Well, just one question I should have asked you when we were talking about the farmers. Are you familiar with the issue of right to repair?
I believe I've seen it, Jeff. I'm not an expert on that. No.
Yeah, so my understanding is that another issue that farmers have to grapple with is they buy very expensive farm equipment, and when there's a malfunction or they want to improve it, the manufacturer forbids them for doing that. And there's an argument on both sides. I think the manufacturer says, well, these tractors are basically computers. They're very, very sophisticated, and we don't want every farmer to change things, manipulate things, and cause more of a problem. So if you try to repair, you break your warranty. And that's the manufacturer's point of view. The farmer's point of view is that we don't want to have to go running back and pay extra money every time there's a problem. We want to be able to fix it at our farm like we have done for generations. So anyway, that's another issue that farmers have to grapple with. But I would, my own personal comments, I think we should be very suspect of the coincidence of all of these policies that are directed towards reducing the food supply. Whether you look at policies meant to increase diesel fuel or price of fertilizer, restrict the accessibility of fertilizer, restrict the access farmers have to water. When you have the World Economic Forum saying they want to eliminate private property, and they don't want people to eat meat anymore, you have to start connecting the dots. And I think there are some nefarious people. We saw what happened with the pandemic. Millions of people died. The world was turned upside down for a couple of years. Tremendous suffering, tremendous death. And, it was denied that was a conspiracy. It was denied that you were crazy for considering that the COVID virus could have come from the Wuhan facility where they were researching that. So anyway, those are my comments. If you would like to make a final comment, feel free.
Yes. In the world of politics, there are very few coincidences. And we have to be very careful to see conspiracies where there are none, but we should make sure that we don't close our eyes to certain things that are demonstrably taking place before our eyes. the people who are in power in the United States, elsewhere in Europe, the World Economic Forum, and all of these people are determined to use whatever means they possibly can to impose their very unique view of the world on the rest of us. And by the way, that is a view of the world that will A, give them more power, and B, line their pockets. They don't care about the well-being of ordinary people with whom they rarely ever come in contact. The current administration in power in Washington, these people are very adept at using the political system. They're using their allies in the media and in social media to not only forward their agenda, but to suppress voices who call certain things into question. We have been seeing that in the climate debate for years, where we had climate deniers. And we also saw this during COVID, where anyone who called into question the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, or the sensibility of lockdowns, facial masks, school shutdowns, these two were COVID deniers. What these people are interested in doing is suppressing any and all forms of dissent, and they will demonize just about anyone for doing that. Sadly, because so many professional associations have been taken over by people of this political ilk, a result of the long march through the institutions brought into being by Italian Communist Party founder Antonio Gramsci almost 100 years ago, that you transform institutions from within. This is the way to lead to their red, and we could even say today green paradise that these people are determined to impose on the rest of us. And so, yes, nothing like a convenient crisis. Go ahead and create a food shortage, create an energy shortage, then you have a crisis. And with a crisis at hand, government has to step in and take over, which is exactly what they wanted in the first place.
Yeah. There are some mendacious people in the world. When COVID started, the Chinese shut down domestic travel to try to restrict the transference of the COVID, but they insisted that international travel continue. They demanded that the Italians and all these other countries accept passengers from coming from China.
That's all the better to spread the disease.
Yeah, so there are people in this world that do want to reduce the population. There are people that make no bones about that, and limiting the food supply is one way to do that. Well, anyway, Bonner Cohen, thank you very much. This was an excellent session. You're extremely well informed. You're a great speaker, very articulate, and we very much appreciate the time that you spent with us. So this session was led by Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research.
Well, thank you very much for having me.